Hello, this is Henry Mosley. I'm continuing the presentation on systems thinking. This is part B. We're going to look at systems thinking and analytical thinking. All of us should be familiar with analytical thinking, also called linear thinking or cause and effect thinking. The usual approach is reductionism. It's the way we look at the parts in order to try to understand the whole. For example, with the HIV epidemic, there will be those scientists who will look at the virus and break it into its molecular parts in order to understand the nature of the virus. Those who are looking at the immune system to understand the immune response. Those who may be looking at the epidemiological context to understand the epidemiology of the transmission of the disease, and on and on. And there are many, many parts to HIV. It's also an economic problem. It's also a social problem. It's also involves the cultural system. But typically we approach it linearly, analytically, looking at the parts in order to try to somehow put it together to understand the whole. Let me give you an example of this. Take an example of urban slums which produce very poor health in the community. And so, as an urban planner, the decision is that we will solve the problem by building new housing. And added to that, we'll improve the water supply and the sanitation sewer system and some transportation communication to improve the health conditions in the urban area. So that's the solution to the problem of urban slums. However, over the next couple of years, we find out that a whole bunch of people from the rural areas move to the urban areas because of improved housing. And eventually, so many of them move into the urban area that the place becomes vastly overcrowded and begins to break down, and we have urban slums again. And again, we see poor health. Well, so we look at this and we say, that's a side effect of the problem. The solution was to build housing. A side effect is the migration. So what do? We cope. We build more housing in order to improve the health conditions in the urban areas. Of course, in the meantime, the side effects are continuing with migration, and the problem goes on, repeats itself over and over again. And we've seen this in many cities, as a matter of fact. Now, there's a problem with this linear thinking. To call the rural-urban migration to better housing a side effect is linear thinking. In linear thinking, we have effects and we have side effects. But the reality is that in systems thinking, there are no side effects. Side effects are not a feature of reality, but a sign that the boundaries of our mental models are too narrow. We're just looking linearly. And our time horizons may be too short, as in the case of the rural-urban migration. We look at the short-term solution and do not realize that improving housing not only in the short run improves health in the urban areas, but in the long run encourages rural-urban migration. You might say, but medications have side effects, and the answer to that is no. Medications do not have side effects. Medications have effects. They have desired effects, and they have undesired effects. But they are not side effects, they are only effects. To use the term side effects means that we are not using systems thinking, we are using linear thinking. We are taking the approach that this causes that, and any other causes of that particular intervention is a side effect, whereas the reality is all of the results of an intervention are effects. There are no side effects in systems. I cannot emphasize this too much, And the reality is, though, that as we say, our boundaries that we think about are too narrow, and we exclude other effects by calling them side effects, and our time horizons are too short. What is the problem? Well, let me summarize it this way. We live and work and think in silos. I want to illustrate this with the next picture. Look at poor urban health. Here's a silo approach. We could start anywhere here, and you look at hunger there as a problem, and so we have food banks to solve the hunger problem. We have bad sanitation, we have the Department of Sanitation. We have no green space, we have the Parks Departments. No transportation, we have the Transportation Authority. We have HIV, we may have a needle exchange program. We have homelessness, we have shelters, we have crime, we have police, and on and on and on. We have all of these silos. Each one of them is thinking linearly that the way to solve the crime problem is to put in more police. The way to solve the AIDS problem is to put in more needle exchange. The way to solve the green space problem is to put in get the Parks Department to do their job. But the point is that all of these are part of the urban health system. And yet, because we live and work in silos, we think that the solution to our problem is a linear solution, and that doing what we do will solve the problem. Actually, it may even aggravate the problem, and I can give you an example of that. Let's look at systems thinking. System thinking looks at the whole and the parts and the interactions among the parts, studying the whole in order to understand the parts. Obviously, when we go back to the HIV problem, we have to understand the parts, but then we have to look at the whole too, to see how all the parts interact if we're going to produce permanent solutions to the problem. So what is a system? A system is something that maintains its existence and functions as a whole through the interaction of the parts. I am making this presentation with a computer system. Through the interaction of the parts in the computer system, you are getting this presentation. But this presentation is only being created through the interaction of the parts. And if any particular part fails, I will not be able to continue this presentation. And I'm part of the system of making this presentation, along with the computer, the software, the hardware, the power supply, and so forth. These are examples of systems from concrete to abstract. We talk about the solar system, which is the sun and the planets and the gravitational fields that produce the solar system, which all operate together. A communication system, which is what we are using now in order for you to get the information from me. A political system, a health system, a cultural system. Some are very concrete, like a communication system with many concrete parts to the system, but some are completely abstract, like a cultural system, which is really a system of values and practices and behaviors, so that there are many different kinds of systems. The essential purpose of a system are those produced by the continuous interactions of the parts that comprise it. They are called emergent properties. The information you are getting right now through this lecture that you see on the screen emerges through the interactions of all the parts of the computer system, and it's through the continuous interaction of the parts. If you switch off the power, the property of the presentation and the audio disappears. so that the purpose of a system is to produce the presentation, the audio and the visual, and it emerges through the interactions of the parts. And I cannot understand the system by taking the parts apart. If you ask me, where did this image come from? I can take the computer apart and I cannot find the image. I can examine the software and I cannot find the image. The image comes through the interaction of the parts, and that's the purpose of the system, is for the parts to interact, and the property is called an emergent property, a new term. Emergent properties of systems, I just talked about computer graphics. Music is an emergent property of musicians and their instruments and the musical score. Telecommunications is an emergent property. To speak to someone over a cell phone emerges only because of the interactions of the parts. Air travel is an emergent property. In order for the airline to move from here to there requires not only the interactions of the parts in the airplane, but if you think about myself traveling, it also requires multiple other parts of many systems in order to get me on the airplane and to get the airplane flying safely. But there are other emergent properties. In a government, freedom or oppression are emergent properties of a political system. Welfare or impoverishment are emergent properties of a government system. Health and disease are emergent properties of a country's political and social and cultural as well as health system and also environmental system as far as that goes. Life and consciousness is an emergent property of any living being, but certainly for consciousness in terms of human beings. And there's no way for us to understand life or consciousness by doing an autopsy. It only emerges as a result of the interaction of the parts. Now, the thing about the emergent properties that I've already explained, they cannot be analyzed by breaking the system into its component parts. They do not yield to direct causal explanations. That is, I can't take this computer and somehow develop a linear model to explain how the computer system has produced the image. And likewise, emergent properties can't be stored or saved. This image can't be stored or saved. It has to be continuously produced. Then as soon as I switch off the computer, the image is gone. So these are characteristics of emergent properties. Now, there's a very powerful characteristic of emergent properties in human systems. And D. Hock, the guy who invented the credit card, writes this: there are groups whose performance transcends that of any individual members. It can be seen in a symphony, a sports team, a ballet, a military squad, a business, or in fact any organization. This performance is an emergent property. It cannot be measured by the usual metrics. It cannot be deliberately achieved by rules or procedures. The transcendent performance arises from the relationships and interactions of the individuals in the group. This is a critical feature of human systems that we will go into shortly, but it really relates not only to all the elements of the system, but in the case of humans, how they relate to each other, the degree to which they share a vision and they share values to produce an outstanding performance beyond anything that could be produced by, for example, another team operating under the same rules and procedures. Now, if we want to solve system problems, there are what we call counterintuitive responses. That is, if we fail to think in terms of systems thinking, we may get adverse consequences. Let me give you an example here. Let's take central Manila. It suffers from severe traffic jams, and these traffic jams are an emergent property. Obviously, if there are no cars on the roads, there would be no traffic jams, and so somehow cars and roads and the way the roads are designed produce traffic jams. Now, here we have a situation that looks like this with severe traffic jams in central Manila. And I asked the question, and you only have two choices. The best solution to relieve the problem among these two choices would be 1, build more roads, or 2, close roads. So, what would you do to reduce traffic jams? Would you build another road? Because central Manila has lots of roads, but there are just too many cars, and so in order to move traffic faster, let's build some more roads. Or would you close a road? And you might say, wow, that certainly seems the wrong thing to do. We've already got more cars on the roads than the roads can handle. Why would we close a road? Well, intuitively, you might think, let's build another road. But if you think in terms of the system, where do traffic jams occur? They occur at the intersections of the roads. Closing a road reduces the intersections, and therefore closing a road will reduce the number of traffic jams. Building a new road, if you think about building a road from corner to corner in this particular image here, you would just produce a lot more intersections and would aggravate the traffic jams, even though it would seem that the best way to get from one corner to another corner would be to build a road across the town, that actually it would increase the number of intersections and increase the traffic jams. Closing a road is what you want to do. Now, the traffic jam is an emergent property. It's made up of roads, cars, and the connections between the parts, and they emerge at the interactions of cars at intersections. And as I indicated, building more roads would increase the intersections and therefore traffic jams. But you might say, let's build an overpass, or as many cities have done, let's build a beltway around the road, or as in Asia they often call it a ring road, and build a ring road around the city or a beltway around the city. But the point is that traffic jams are a socio-cultural problem, and that if you built an overpass over the town, or a ring road, or a beltway, to reduce connections, it will eventually slow down the traffic because the intervention has delayed effects. When you build a beltway or a ring road, people will say, gee, that's a faster way to go. I'm now going to set up my business or my home out here on the beltway where I can move faster, and I'm going to buy some more cars. And pretty soon you find out that the beltway or the ring road becomes congested. Why? Because people are making choices according to their self-interest. Let me give an example of that. The first time I was in Beijing was in 1976. And at that time, they had built one ring road around the city, but it had become so crowded they were building a second ring road. The last time I was there was in about 2006, and at that time, Beijing had 6 ring roads. They probably have more now. Because what is happening? That every time you build a ring road, people move there in order to avoid the traffic, and it creates more traffic. And the point is that we haven't thought about the system. We think that ring roads linearly should, in our linear thinking, should reduce the traffic jams, but actually it increases traffic jams in the longer run. And you can keep building and building ring roads. And in fact, Beijing now is approaching a population of 100 million because of the way the city is expanding and expanding and expanding, simply by this type of construction. Perhaps the solution is build another city and get people to move out of Beijing instead of adding ring roads and getting people to move into Beijing. But the point is, you get counterintuitive results because people are making choices according to their self-interest and values. So we can talk about a model, a systems model, and Singhi produces a number of these. He calls this one a fix that backfires. You have traffic jams, you build overpasses and throughways, more cars are driven, you get more traffic jams, you build more overpasses or throughways or ring roads or bypasses, and people respond to that by moving there to avoid the traffic, and the problem keeps going and going and going. So this is another characteristic of human systems, is that you get counterintuitive responses. This concludes part B of this presentation.